Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified.
Good evening, and welcome to News from Neptune for the 11th week of 2016. At the end of a long hiatus, we're glad to be back. I'm Carl Estabrook. For 25 years, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, but I was deplatformed there. Deplatforming is a recent coinage in the university and media. It means depriving someone of a place to speak because of what they're saying. I appreciate the chance to come to you now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and David Johnson and I will try to say some true things. It's March 18th. On this day in the year 1871, it was the formal declaration of the Paris Commune, the modern form of politics, according to some intelligent observers. The president of the French Republic, Adolphe Thiers, ordered the evacuation of Paris as soon as the Commune was declared, and the French army, which had recently been bested by the Prussian army, descended upon Parisians and carried out a massacre to destroy the Commune. On this day in 1942, the War Relocation Authority of the United States government was established to take Japanese Americans into custody on the basis of their race and nothing else. On this day in 1969, the United States began secretly bombing the country of Cambodia. Noam Chomsky wrote some years later, 2004, on May 27th, the New York Times published one of the most incredible sentences I've ever seen. They ran an article about the Nixon-Kissinger interchanges, which had recently been published. Kissinger fought very hard through the courts to try to prevent it, but the courts permitted it. You read through it, and you see the following statement embedded in it. Nixon at one point informs Kissinger, his right-hand Eichmann, that he wanted bombing of Cambodia. And Kissinger loyally transmits the order to the Pentagon to carry out, quote, a massive bombing campaign in Cambodia. Anything that flies on anything that moves, close quote. That is the most explicit call for what we call genocide when other people do it that I've ever seen in the historical record. Right at this moment, this is 2004, there's a prosecution of Milosevic from Serbia going on in the International Tribunal, and the prosecutors are kind of hampered because they can't find direct orders or a direct connection even linking Milosevic to any of the atrocities on the ground. Suppose they found a statement like this. Suppose a document came out from Milosevic saying, reduce Kosovo to rubble, anything that flies on anything that moves. They would be overjoyed. The trial would be over. He would be sent away for multiple life sentences, if it was a U.S. trial, immediately to the electric chair. But they can't find any such document. In fact, nobody has even found a document like that connecting Hitler to the Holocaust. Scholars have been working on it for years. I can't remember an example of such a direct order to carry out what amounted to a huge massacre way beyond the level of anything we call genocide when other people do it. A few years later, commenting on the Nixon-Kissinger bombing of Cambodia, Chomsky pointed out the records say that the U.S. wanted to use anything that flies against anything that moves during the bombing of Cambodia, and the result was 5 times the bombing that was reported before, greater than all the bombing in all the theaters of World War II on this one peasant country. It created the Khmer Rouge, which the rest of the world found scandalous, but without ever noticing that the source of the horrors in Cambodia was the Nixon and Kissinger regime. You're watching News from Neptune, a War and Resistance edition, and I have in mind particularly this week what the late Fred Branfman calls the world's most evil and lawless institution, the executive branch of the U.S. government, executive branch leaders have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years, mostly civilians, and we're in the midst of a national exercise to pick a new executive to continue this tradition, undoubtedly. We'll go to David Johnson.
Okay, I want to talk today about Hillary Clinton's horrible foreign policy record. And, you know, the chickens are coming home to roost still because of her tenure at the State Department. The most recent example is in Honduras. Less than 2 weeks after Berta Cáceres' brutal slaying, another member of her activist group was shot and killed after the Honduran government violently evicted his indigenous community from its ancestral land. Nelson Garcia, father of 5 and community leader, was shot 4 times in the face, gunned down in his home. The Nation reported his assassination occurred less than 2 weeks after Cáceres' and only 2 days following her funeral. Local reports say that his death occurred shortly after the Honduran government's dispatching of riot police and bulldozers to evict 150 indigenous people from their homes in Rio Chiquito, where they had occupied ancestral land for 2 years in protest of an Agua Zarca mega dam project. Garcia was a leader in the Rio Chiquito community, of all whom were members of the Civic Council of Popular Indigenous Organizations of Honduras. What's interesting about this is that this mega dam project is another example of neoliberalism in practice. The mega dam is built on the Guadalquivir River, it's on the homeland, the native land of the indigenous people in that area who have resisted building of this dam. Cáceres' daughter, Berta Cáceres, only yesterday told the Guardian newspaper in an interview that her mother's death is not the final assassination, but one of a series of assassinations of human rights defenders. Garcia's death brings to 14 the number of these people who were killed and murdered since the group was founded. Witness to Cáceres' murder and fellow indigenous activist Gustavo Castro was blocked by the Honduran government from returning to Mexico last week, and he is currently still being held in the Mexican embassy in Tegucigalpa for fear of his life, despite international pleas for the government to allow him to safely leave the country. Honduras is suffering under a brutal regime put in place by a U.S.-backed military coup in 2009, supported by Hillary Clinton during her tenure as Secretary of State. This only became public knowledge because of, thank goodness for WikiLeaks, because when this was going on in the immediate aftermath, the State Department, Hillary Clinton's State Department and the Obama administration denied they had any involvement in this coup, and WikiLeaks exposed that as an outright lie. Clinton, during her, since the coup, the country has maintained the highest murder rate in the world, and many environmental and indigenous rights activists have been killed under the military junta's rule. After news of Garcia's murder broke, the Europe-based development bank, FMO, and FinFund announced that because of the violence and killings, they would end their operations in Honduras entirely, which will mean pulling their funding for the Agua Zarca mega dam. Telesur, the Venezuelan news service, reported that U.S. Agency for International Development, on the other hand, is continuing to fund Agua Zarca in defiance of activist protests at the agency's headquarters in Washington, D.C. earlier this week, and despite the continued violence and murders of environmentalists and indigenous activists in Honduras. Most recently, as of yesterday, a group of 730 leading Latin American experts and scholars have condemned the assassination of Honduran activist Berta Cáceres and urged U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry to halt aid and support to Honduras until the Central American country improve its atrocious human rights record. Despite Honduras' worsening human rights conditions, the United States government is providing an aid package to the region, the Alliance for Prosperity in the Northern Triangle. So here we go. I mean, this is just the fruits of neoliberalism in practice, that basically the wealth of wealthy individuals and corporations takes precedent over human rights and local autonomy.
Thank you, David. I think we'll go on. There's a lot to talk about there, and certainly there's a lot to talk about with the question of Mrs. Clinton, but maybe we'll go on to David Green for some other remarks. Put a number of things on the table, and then we'll get at them.
The one thing, for whatever reason, I know there's a lot of pressing issues and the election and Bernie Sanders and all kinds of things, but I wanted to bring to the attention of our listeners something that that is a little more obscure because the person that is involved, who used to be here, is no longer here. I'm speaking of Linda Katehi, former vice chancellor up until a few years ago, who was appointed chancellor at UC Davis several years ago, and then has achieved some notoriety there during the sort of the Occupy phase, in which some of her students were pepper sprayed by a cop. That became a rather famous meme of that time. She's back in the news just recently, as I stumbled across a few days ago. Her resignation is being called for by students who are, I think, occupying her office, either have been occupying her office for the last week or so, and perhaps are still occupying her office at UC Davis, which is near Sacramento, California. The Sacramento Bee reports, I'll just read a few snippets from the Sacramento Bee. The UC Davis Chancellor Linda Katehi has undergone significant scrutiny and criticism during her tenure at the university, stemming from incidents such as pepper spraying of peacefully protesting students, to her service on corporate boards that did not reflect favorably on the university or her office. Even before becoming West, Katehi was hit with allegations of influence peddling while serving as an administrator at the University of Illinois. It further says UC Davis Chancellor Linda P.B. Katehi received $420,000 in compensation as a board member for John Wiley & Sons, a leading publisher of science, engineering, and math textbooks for universities. Katehi served on the Wiley board from 2012 to 2014, according to Securities and Exchange filings. She received $125,000 in paid stock, et cetera, talks about each of those years. Under pressure, Katehi resigned this week from the board of DeVry Education Group as the for-profit company faces scrutiny from federal officials for allegedly deceiving students about job and income process. If you watch any TV, you see a lot of ads for DeVry, which is, of course, again, an extension of this neoliberal concept that you invest in yourself and your skills, and then feel yourself lucky to get a job that's enough to help you pay off your debts. Katehi's decision in February to accept a paid board seat from DeVry prompted State Senator Marty Block in California to demand information on how much she and other chancellors receive in side income at a Capitol hearing Thursday on the Education Fund. This story was from a couple of weeks ago on March 3rd. Another little snippet here from someone named Ed Howard, a senior counsel for the Center of Public Interest Law, said the Wiley board seat potentially posed a conflict of interest for Katehi. She was, quote, being paid a huge sum of money by a private for-profit corporation that is business with the University of California. It's pretty much the dictionary definition of a conflict of interest, Ed Howard said. Later on, he's quoted as saying, in response to the money-making skills of both her and Henry Yang, president of UC Santa Barbara, who made $1 million over a 10-year period doing consulting work. Howard, quoted as saying, "Oh my God, if these two chancellors have so much free time that they are able to earn $1 million and $400,000 while moonlighting, maybe we should cut their pay and use it to help people price out of the University of California." Another little snippet, Katehi resigned her $70,000 a year seat from DeVry, the DeVry board, after a discussion with UC President Janet Napolitano, who, of course, is a graduate of the Homeland Security Office, who became president of the University of California. UC spokeswoman Diane Klein said Wednesday that Katehi violated policy when she accepted the board seat without UC permission at a DeVry trustee meeting this past February. Finally, the Federal Trade the Federal Trade Commission suit filed against DeVry on January 27th contends the company made false and unsubstantiated claims when it began advertising around 2008 that 90% of its graduates obtained well-paying jobs in their fields within 6 months of graduation. In this day and age, anybody just reading that would know that that's got to be false. Federal officials also take issue with a 2013 claim that DeVry graduates earn more than other graduates. Finally, University of California President Napolitano says UC Davis Chancellor Linda Katehi had good intentions when she accepted a seat on the board of DeVry Education Group. The chancellor has since apologized and taken other appropriate measures, Napolitano said. And one final word that I got as I was doing a little Google searching and reading about UC Davis, Linda Katehi is married to a man named, I memorized this Greek name and now I forgot it, but it's something like Suriganis. That's it, Suriganis. I noticed that there was a young woman who was the chief of staff of the Student Affairs Department, probably a six-figure job at UC Davis, a woman named Emily Prieto Suriganis, who, when one does a little more Googling, finds out that she is, of course, the wife of Linda Katehi's son, her daughter-in-law. So at the age of probably no more than 30, she has achieved a six-figure salary in as a kind of liaison within the Department of Student Affairs at her mother-in-law's campus. So add to the corruption and graft, add a little nepotism in there. Stir, shake well, and we've got the modern neoliberal university in full flower.
I'm afraid we do, and thank you, David, for that. You're watching News from Neptune, and there's a lot here on the table. I would perhaps like to go back to David Johnson's reflections on Mrs. Clinton as a political candidate. There's a piece on Counterpunch this morning entitled, "Could Hillary Clinton Be Worse Than Trump?" It's written by Andrew Levine, who writes a number of things for Counterpunch. Levine says no, but I must admit, I think the answer may well be yes. Levine says, and I think he's right about this, because Trump is neither a neoliberal nor a neocon, his views are often to the left of Hillary's. Clinton, on the other hand, is a Clintonite, a devotee of liberal interventionism and of neoliberal economic nostrums, as David was describing, and of course with a clear willingness to kill people in pursuit of those neoliberal economic nostrums. So what do you think, gentlemen? Could Hillary Clinton be worse than Trump? David, you got a view on that?
No, I think they'd be the same. I think their policies would be the same because let's not forget what Manuel Zelaya, who was a deposed democratically elected president from Honduras in that coup, said in an interview about a year or so after the coup on Democracy Now!, when asked about the Obama administration's complicity in this, him being the chief of the American, I guess you'd call it a Prax Americana global corporate empire, and he said, no, that's not true. President Obama is not he said, El Jefe, which means the boss of the American empire. And I think he hit the nail right on the head. Excuse my little carpenter expression, but anyway, I think he's absolutely right. The President of the United States is really just a public relations figurehead, more or less. They're not going to do anything different. There's other people that rule this country. I mean, considering the ruling class. There's a long list of people you could consider in that ruling class, but nevertheless, they do have certain, even though they may have differences at times, they do have consistency in policy. And regardless if a Hillary Clinton or a Donald Trump would get elected in terms of foreign policy or even domestic issues, they're not going to do anything that's going to to upset the ruling class. I mean, Donald Trump can talk all of his vile racism all he wants and talk about how he's going to build a wall and all this and that, but when the push comes to shove, if he's elected president, he's not going to do anything different than what the ruling class has already planned on doing. And likewise, if Hillary Clinton's elected, it's the same. It's going to be the case. Most of these elections, well, this year in particular, these elections are nothing really. It's a dog and pony show theatrical presentation to try to get voters to vote because they know that the vast majority of the people in this country are unhappy with the current system. So, each is trying to tap into fear, identity politics, and other things in order to try to get people interested. And that's pretty much my take on it.
What do you think, David?
Well,
Hillary worse than Donald?
yeah, well, I mean, the question is, when you ask a hypothetical like that without the possibility of, a counterfactual, knowing what happens, what would have happened, whether one or the other becomes president, all that can be said is that when Hillary Clinton becomes president, which she probably will, the question is whether the people to her left, the people now supporting Bernie Sanders, will act as any kind of brake on her actions, particularly in relation to foreign policy.
The way they held Obama's feet to the fire, right?
Right, exactly.
Exactly.
But of course, there's a different sort of calculus now that people have thrown in their lot with Bernie Sanders, have at the same time recognized Hillary Clinton as a more naked form of neoconservative ideology with her record, whereas Obama was popular and didn't really have a foreign policy record, and in fact had even allegedly opposed the Iraq War.
Exactly.
So the question is, what do? We, if I, include myself in under the broad Sanders tent, even though that's not exactly right. What do we do in response to a Hillary Clinton presidency, and in relation to the pushback that Trump might get from people who find him vile for genuine reasons, but for reasons that, in relation to how they view Hillary, often turn out to be a little superficial also.
I should mention perhaps that the three of us, although are not, none of us is an official representative of the Green Party in any way. All three of us have been involved with the refoundation of the local chapter of the Green Party USA, the Prairie Greens as they're called, and the probable presidential candidate of the Green Party will be Jill Stein, who was here in Champaign a week or so ago. And I think that if it is indeed a Trump-Clinton election, as David suggests it may be, and I think most people suggest it may be, I'll be voting for Jill Stein, and I assume my colleagues will be too.
Are you voting for her because this is a safe blue state, or because you would advise anyone to vote for Jill Stein?
That's a more difficult question. I mean, if indeed there was that's harder. I'm voting for Stein because it looks like I voted in Illinois won't make too much difference anyhow. Illinois will be a Democratic state in the Electoral College. But if not, then the question arises again. Is Trump worse than Clinton? And I must admit, my feeling on many things these days is that the answer is yes. That Trump... and some other interesting people seem to think that too.
That Trump is worse than Clinton?
Clinton is worse than Trump, right. Uh-huh. Robert Kagan, the noted neocon, war hawk, principal intellectual figure, if we dare say that, for the war party in this country, has said he's abandoning the Republican Party because Trump is not belligerent enough. Trump is not going to get his war on adequately, but Mrs. Clinton will, and therefore he, Kagan, will go support Clinton. and a good number of the traditional neocons, the war party in this country, are perfectly happy with the Obama administration for obvious reasons. That is, the wars continue under the Obama administration, have now said that they've got to rally to Clinton because they can't count on Trump keeping those wars going. I think there's something to that. Clinton is the pro-war, pro-Wall Street candidate, and Trump has suggested various things, including a lack of belief in Mrs. Clinton's assertion that Vladimir Putin is the new Hitler, that suggests he might not be. What do you think, David?
Well, it's hard to say because even though Trump in the past has made sort of, I guess, subtle anti-war statements, but then he comes back and talks about how he's going to take the terror campaign of ISIS, of their beheadings, and put it back on them tenfold. Excuse me, and that he's also saw one expert where he's telling a story about the resistance to the U.S. occupation of the Philippines back in the Spanish-American War, about bragging about how they were the U.S. military, murdered or executed resistance leaders and left one alive and had him go back and tell him, what had happened, and that they put the fear of the U.S. and the fear of God into them and stuff. So I think he just makes it up as he goes along. I mean, the bottom line of Donald Trump is that he's got an ego the size of the Grand Canyon. He's tapping into a very ugly side of element in this in our society, and I think it seems almost like this is an intentional tactic to try to divide the American people. I mean, in the general sense. On the other hand, because of his big ego and everything, it seems that the ruling class is a little concerned about him. I think they're concerned about Bernie Sanders talking about all the issues he has, hence the lack of media coverage. And I think they're concerned about Donald Trump, that they never know where he's going to be on his opinions one time or the next, or that maybe he's going to stir up a very ugly racist, fascist element in the country that might get out of hand. However, you still see this all this corporate media coverage of Donald Trump, like I mentioned before many times about my experience right before Christmas going to the doctor's office with my wife, and how I had to wait for 20 minutes in the waiting room, and in a 20-minute period, I heard Donald Trump's name mentioned at least 70 times. Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama's named about a half a dozen times, and Bernie Sanders' name not mentioned once, even though they were talking about the New Hampshire upcoming primary election, and how Clinton was behind. So I don't know what I'm not really sure at this point, but it's definitely going to be an interesting coming year, that's for sure.
In terms of who's directing the campaign in what directions, very interesting observation from Glenn Ford, who writes for the excellent Black Agenda report. He says, if Hillary Clinton can make the general election into a crusade against bigotry and intolerance, as embodied by Donald Trump, she can win with an otherwise issueless campaign, thus shielding the 1% from harm. Black folks will be happy imagining the election is all about them. The great task of independent black politics is to pry black folks loose from the Democratic Party's lethal embrace. Now, I think Ford's quite right about that, and I think that we hear all this stuff about what a terrible person Donald Trump is. I have no doubt that Donald Trump is a terrible person. I have no doubt that any of the people who are in the Republican and Democratic presidential race are terrible people.
Well, certainly not Bernie Sanders.
Well,
he's not a terrible person.
I'll take that back. But the way in which the Clinton campaign wants to demonize, and that's the word, Mr. Trump on the basis of his outrageous comments of the sort that David Johnston was talking about, is a tactic that serves their interests because it puts the focus on Trump's character, on bigotry, and on intolerance, which are very easy to run against. You have very few people coming out in favor of bigotry and intolerance, even those who seem to be saying bigoted and intolerant things, like Mr. Trump. Therefore, the Clinton campaign is safe from any criticism of its pro-war and pro-Wall Street position. I think that's the the real focus of Donald Trump. And if you have a conspiratorial frame of mind, you might say that that was what Donald Trump got in there for in the first place, to help his friends, the Clintons. I don't think that's true, by the way, but that has been suggested, as we know.
It is true that the Trumps and the Clintons have a
Yeah, we
friendship
know.
going back 30 years. I mean, so one has to wonder. I mean, like you said, Carl, we can't delve too much into speculation. However, what we're seeing as far as past practices and evidence, it indicates there's a lot more to, beneath the surface than that's being shown. As usual.
Well, and the question here always is cui bono, whose interests are
Yes.
being served? And if you start asking that question about the Trump and Clinton campaigns, whose interests are being served, you come up with some interesting variations. I think we may see one in relationship to the APAC conference coming up.
Yeah. Remind me to talk about that after I get done with what I'm thinking. I don't want to lose my train of thought.
I know the problem, I have a notebook.
But I should remind myself. I brought a pen for a change. But anyway, I'm interested. I don't know how many of our listeners really follow the same leftist websites, but you've got the usual ones, Counterpunch and ZNet. And what the Sanders campaign has wrought there is some very, very, very interesting commentaries, which you mentioned before, Carl, Andrew Levine at Counterpunch, whose main purpose, I think, is to remind, besides having reasonable arguments, is to remind people how horrible the Clintons are. But also Jeffrey Sinclair, who's the proprietor of Counterpunch, and Paul Street, who sort of used to be, who publishes at both ZNet and Counterpunch, but seems to be more prominent at Counterpunch these days, are more openly skeptical of Bernie Sanders and his motives and the prospects for Bernie Sanders, whereas interestingly, Michael Albert, the proprietor of ZNet, who's identified with the very grassroots sort of anarchist point of view and the Chomskyan point of view, has been, for reasons which I think he's laid out in articulate fashion, very positive about the Sanders campaign and what the implications may be for broader leftist organizing in politics at the grassroots level in this country. So you see people, I think, having to consider a variety of factors, and I think we need to ask ourselves ultimately the implications of the possible coming breakup of the Republican Party due to Trump, or alternatively, or either or both, the breakup of the Democratic Party in the aftermath of either a Sanders victory or a Sanders defeat, because it's pretty clear that the Democratic Party can't go on as a second neoliberal party. We've got two neoliberal parties, and what the prospect of Sanders' surprising success so far is that the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party can go on as they are. They can no longer pretend to their base, either the evangelical base or the the leftist base, that this can go on this way. So it would be more honest for Hillary Clinton to come out of this representing one corporate, quote-unquote, centrist party, meaning centrist of the 1%, and then the actual American center, which includes everybody, all the 2/3 of the people who want single-payer health care and are anti-trade, anti-quote-unquote free trade, get a party either to the left or the right of that.
I think something like this is right, and to sort it out, we have to recognize, although it doesn't seem so on the surface, that the Sanders movement and the Trump movement are a lot alike. They represent people in this country who are outraged and upset with politics as usual, which means the neoliberal and neoconservative party structures of the Republicans and the Democrats. The Sanders people and the Trump people object to that, and they are objecting from the same basic positions, a position that says, look, my life has not been adequately served by the politicians we've elected, even when they've said things that I was in favor of. I want something different. I do not want an economy run for the benefit of the 1%. I don't want a foreign policy run for the benefit of the defense lobby, the Israel lobby, and the military. The conjunction of that in the Trump and Sanders campaign is, I think, on the way to forcing the sort of realignment that David's talking about, and that I've been predicting for about 10 years, but that's another story.
But you're going to keep predicting until it comes
Until
true.
it comes true,
Right.
exactly. Well, it's a question of all in the timing. It's all in the
right,
timing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that what the Democrats and Republicans have been doing for decades now is basically relying on identity politics to distinguish themselves from each other.
Exactly.
Again, you've got the progressive identity politics that Hillary Clinton is playing to, and you've got this kind of regressive identity
Exactly.
politics that Trump is playing to. But ironically, both the Sanders and the Trump campaign are founded on something more profound, even in the Trump sense,
Exactly.
than identity politics. They're profound. They're, again, as you said, they're founded on this deep dissatisfaction with which people see
Exactly.
in their lives. And the question is, identity politics is like the center now of it's how the limits of allowable debate are drawn. And the people, the spectacular success in the overall picture of things, the spectacular success of Trump and Sanders getting most of the votes when you conclude both parties, means that identity politics can no longer really hold in the way that it has.
Thank you, David. I think that's true. You're watching news from Neptune. There's a lot here, and it ramifies. In the old SDS maxim, everything is connected, and we can follow these connections for a good while. I want to make sure that before we finish tonight, we mention two other big things that occurred while we were gone, and get my colleagues to comment on them. They're both a matter of withdrawals, you might say. The Russian withdrawal, such as it is, from Syria, and Obama's withdrawal from the foreign policy establishment, such as it is, set out an amazing interview with an Israel firster in the Atlantic magazine this last week that is an exercise in self-justification by one of the most devious people ever to occupy the White House, Barack Obama. And so it takes a fair amount of working through and interpreting to see what's going on there, particularly since we don't know much about the real politics that are going on in American foreign policy, except when we hear exposés by people like Seymour Hersh about the sort of turf fights in the foreign policy of the Obama administration, which of course has been equally warlike with the Bush administration, but has simply managed to cover sin with smooth names, as the scriptures say. And now we have Obama himself giving a long justification for an explanation for what he was doing. How much it can be trusted, we don't know, in the Atlantic. Takes on the Atlantic interview, either of you?
Unfortunately, I didn't read the Atlantic interview as far as the Russian withdrawal from Syria. I'm not certain. I think this might have to do with the, conjunction with the attempts at a peace process. The only thing I can interpret out of this is that, the Russians probably thought that they, kind of went there and, did what they could to support the Syrian government. And then they thought they would draw, probably for public relations reasons, to say, well, look, we're no longer militarily involved. We did what we had to do to stop terrorism with ISIS, and now we need to get busy with some type of peace agreement. Other than that, I really don't have any take on that, and unfortunately, I didn't read the Atlantic article.
It takes a while to read the Atlantic article. You have to keep your disgust down in order to do it. So,
I didn't. I've seen the article, and I've seen references to it, and I've seen commentaries on it, but I haven't sort of plowed through the article yet and deciphered, you know,
Yeah.
I figured it would be a lot of work to sort of decipher all the agendas going on here. With things have become so complicated, but the bottom line is one thing I would throw out there is that the APAC summit is coming up, or the annual APAC conference, which they invite candidates. Of course, in this year they're inviting candidates. Trump is going to speak, and so forth. Hillary Clinton is going to speak. Bernie Sanders is not going to speak, which is, I think, sort of a big deal that he's not going to speak.
Yep.
And meanwhile, some of the opponents to the Israel lobby, some of the usual suspects that I refer to all the time on this show, Mondo Weiss, Philip Weiss, Max Blumenthal, and so forth, they're having a kind of side conference, which is just a panel, which is going on for a day or two, which is actually being broadcast on the Real News Network. And again, the question that this panel asks is Israel a bad influence on U.S. foreign policy? And I think that's just the wrong, as I've said about 3,000 times on this program, that's the wrong question to be asking. It dampens my spirits to think that in the year 2016, a bunch of really pretty smart, decent people are still asking the question, is Israel bad for U.S. foreign policy? I don't know if this bears on the Goldberg interview and the nature of the Obama Goldberg thing going on, but of course, Goldberg is saying, Goldberg is staunch old line, but he represents liberal views to the extent that he feels that the U.S. that Israel merits this loyalty, and as well as all the aid that goes on with it. But the people considering foreign policy are operating in a slightly larger context now.
The real issue, of course, is American foreign policy, as it always has been, in regard to this. I mean, in fantasies on both the left and the right of the government of Israel somehow secretly manipulating the government of the United States in ways that are not in the interests of the American 1%. That's pretty hard to take. That certainly doesn't account for the long and bloody history of the U.S. patronage of Israel. To turn into the question of Russia, though, I think there's been some interesting developments there, and those too are bound up with our understanding of what the United States is doing, what this administration is doing in foreign policy, given the particularly misdirected way in which administration foreign policy is presented to the American public. I've said for a while that Obama learned all he needed to know about foreign policy on the basketball court, where the rule was fake left, drive right. And that he has done that in the political universe from the beginning and seems to be doing that once again now, even in these late days when he's saying, well, the foreign policy establishment made me do things that have turned out badly. The things that I did turned out okay, of course. Now, a better reading of American foreign policy in context would include also some understanding of what the Russians have actually done in Syria. But the important point is what America's done in Syria. There was a horrible article in the Washington Post this morning by a neocon think tank sort who I think teaches the poor young women at Smith College. But in any case, he says that, well, Obama simply had to pull up his socks and get better at exercising American power in Syria. And it's full of cliches, by the way, that one gets used to. What we're getting from this neocon academic background is the notion that, well, Obama's a wimp because he's killed an awful lot of people, but he hasn't killed enough of the right people. And he should be doing more of that. And if he really got it together, then he would do that. The article has to be read to be believed, but unfortunately, it's all too typical of what we get from the American commentariat. Now, what in fact is going on in Syria from the Russian point of view seems to me to be much more straightforward and much more understandable, and by the way, much more honestly presented by the Russian government. The Russians said, look, 3 months ago, they said, 5 months ago now, they said, we support the legitimate government of Syria, which is facing an insurrection made up largely of jihadists, Salafists, and covertly backed by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. There's a civil war in Syria as a result, and the people who are winning are Al Qaeda, the jihadists that America has sponsored off and on for more than 40 years. Now, and if you want some testimony for the truth of that, look at the very important article in Harper's in January by Andrew Coburn about the American support for jihadism at its origins and then again today. What was going on in Syria was an attempt to overthrow a government which the U.S. couldn't find entirely biddable. They wouldn't do exactly what they were told. For example, they lined up with Iran when the U.S. was busily trying to demonize Iran. And therefore, the U.S. got behind what looked like originally a popular uprising against the government of Syria, the Assad government in Syria. But that popular uprising was immediately taken over by the CIA. The CIA was sending arms to it through Benghazi. That's what the Benghazi bit was about originally. And financing it through the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia and through Turkey. Both of those countries having designs on Syria as a whole. So the result was a jihadist civil war in Syria, and the Russians said, look, this is directly in our interest. Look at a map and see why. We fought against these people in Chechnya. Here they are again, about to establish a base that threatens us Russians from that direction again. In the meantime, we support the legitimate government of Syria and will aid them militarily in fighting off this proxy war that the U.S. is encouraging in Syria as a whole. They sent troops, primarily Air Force, into Syria to do that, and were remarkably successful in doing it. They turned the tide of battle in Syria, in which the jihadists and their various groups were winning against the Syrian army, and now the Syrian army is back in a position where it controls the major population centers in Syria and is able to hold off the ongoing jihadist insurgency. The Russians never intervene on the side of the Assad government beyond saying that they accepted the invitation to defend a legitimate government against its enemies. The U.S., of course, has no such invitation into Syria and never has. So the Russian position was legally much more straightforward from the beginning. The Russians established the military dominance the dominance of the air that the Syrian army needed, and then withdrew to everyone's surprise. Because, of course, the U.S. press had been full of stuff about how this was Putin trying to reestablish the Soviet empire. This was Greater Russia from the 19th century, expanding into the Middle East. Remarkable nonsense you hear from major propaganda websites like Vox and Politico and various other places about the evil Russian plots. God, I thought I woke up in 1956. I mean, I heard this all when I was a kid. It wasn't true then. It's not true now. And then, to everyone's amazement, Putin did exactly what he said he was going to do, that is, support the legitimate government and then bring his troops home. There is a Russian military presence, as there was before, naval and air force in Syria, but he's withdrawn the expeditionary force that supported the Syrian government. More power to him. You can rightly criticize any military operations that involves bombing the Middle East. The U.S. knows how that's done, right? But on the other hand, if there is a justifiable side in the Syrian business, it's the side of the legitimate government, and that's what the Russians were supporting. Their withdrawal has left the U.S. in a quandary because Obama's happy account of Putin entering a quagmire seems to be, once again, inaccurate and propagandistic, as practically everything the Obama administration says about the Middle East has been. So the real situation now is that there is indeed a peace conference that has some possibility, given backing by Russia and the United States, of establishing some sort of stasis in Syria. And Obama, in his self-serving account of foreign policy, said that the high point of his career, his foreign policy career as president, was deciding in 2013 not to bomb Syria, which certainly planned to do, and was finally stopped from doing by the opposition of everyone from the British government to a major opposition in the United States, and the diplomacy of the Putin regime. So now this has become Obama's great triumph.
So I guess my question would be, is there a genuine difference between Obama and his more militant critics? I mean, he's made the deal with Iran that they opposed, not to mention things like Cuba, and so is there a real difference? Is there, do they just influence him to get what they want, or is he, what is the dynamic between Obama and the people allegedly to his right, the neocons?
Yeah, well, but no, I think you have to, well, there's a difference there, I think, between, let me start it this way. Obama seems to me to be, in effect, not necessarily in what he says, which has little relation to what he does, as we know, Obama seems to me to be perfectly in line with American Middle East politics as they have existed for more than a generation. And the notion that he has somehow departed from that tradition by doing the so-called nuclear deal with Iran, I think is quite false. The U.S. primary interest in the Middle East is to control the flow of oil, not because the U.S. needs the oil, we never have, but because controlling that flow gives the U.S. an unparalleled advantage over countries that need the oil, from Germany to China. This is called offshore control in the Pentagon when it's talked when China is the subject. Now, so what the Obama administration has done is worked rather more effectively than they have described themselves to reestablish the status quo ante, the point at which the U.S. really had control over Middle East oil flows, and that control rested on a tripod of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran, an effective alliance among those three. That arrangement was knocked into a cocked hat in 1979 by the Iranian Revolution, and the U.S. has worked ever since then to try to reestablish that control, to reincorporate Iran by foul means or fair back into that overall structure of order, as Henry Kissinger said, that means the U.S. is in control in the Middle East. That's finally what the fuss about Iran and therefore the fuss about Syria is really about. What the Obama people have done is, in spite of the dismay from Israel and Saudi Arabia, has accomplished much of that. And they now have a structure of alliance in the Middle East that has, again, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel working together for overall U.S. control. That has to be counted a coup. I'm sorry, that's not the best word in this case. That has to be counted a success in the context of American policy. Now, we would say a much greater success would be the withdrawal of American military from the Middle East, stop killing people, and let the local people decide what to do with the resources that are under their sand. But given what the United States has done consistently in Republican and Democrat administrations for more than a generation, the Obama people are down with the program. And they've succeeded, even against crazies, and there are plenty of them around, who say, oh, you got to go out and kill more Arabs, you got to go out and kill more ISIS, you got to go kill somebody, or we're not doing our job. And that's pretty close to what the think tank land piece in the Washington Post says this morning.
I think it's as usual. I mean, the ruling class in this country, it's not a monolithic block per se. I mean, there's differences of agreement. And I think most of the time that comes down to a difference of opinion on tactics, because they all want the same thing as far as, more wealth for the 1%, more absolute control of the world economy and the politics of the world as well, geopolitically. And I think Cuba's a perfect case in point. I mean, okay, fine. So Obama made it a little easier for U.S. Citizens to travel to Cuba. But nevertheless, I mean, you look at what's the objective there. I mean, the objective is to try to bring Cuba into the neoliberal corporate fold after all these years through a combination of economic pressures. He's just throwing a little carrot out there and still having the stick, though, because the embargo's still in place. And it's not total free access per se, because still, when American citizens go to visit there, they still have to get permission from the Treasury Department, still have to pay a fee to the Treasury Department, still are required to stay and go with established groups for either educational or cultural reasons. They're not allowed to bring any Cuban products back unless it's books, magazines, or DVDs, or art, which is kind of odd. And when they talk about, when Obama and John Kerry stand up there and saying that, they have normalized relations more with Cuba, but they still have concerns about human rights.
Right.
Well, that's actually just code word for bringing them into the neoliberal corporate world order. The only human rights problems I know about in Cuba is at the Guantanamo military base. There are definite human rights problems. And they want to talk about Cuba. What about Honduras? What about Haiti? What about Colombia? And let's talk about even Mexico. There are some real human rights problems, but oh no, never a word there. I mean, Cuba's not perfect, but you compare to those countries, it's sterling.
David, before we get out of here, you wanted to mention an
Yes,
upcoming event?
there's going to be an event at Channing Murray on the corner of Oregon and Matthews this coming Tuesday at 7 p.m. An author named Cindy Milstein will be there talking about her book, Taking Sides, Revolutionary Solidarity and the Poverty of Liberalism. It's being sponsored by the local Radical Reading Group, and it'd be really interesting to turn out. It's going to be a really good event.
There's also going to be a reading of a new play, an important new play, at the Station Theater a week from Monday evening at 7:30. There's a note about it in Smile Politely this week. You've been watching news from Neptune for the 11th week of 2016, a resistance and withdrawal edition. I'm Carl Esterbrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and David Johnson. Our thanks to our directors and producers, Jason and Yosef. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what's to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.